Welcome to Acton Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Eric Kohn. I want to thank you for listening, and I ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate now to the show notes for this episode, where you'll find a link to subscribe directly to Acton Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else that fine podcast products are available. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find our show. For the second week in a row, we're going to have a slightly different program for you today. Today, we have published the lead essay for the fall 2022 issue of Religion and Liberty. The theme of this issue of Religion and Liberty is on the Metaverse, and that lead essay is from Acton's own Dan Huger, titled "The Metaverse Does Not Exist." So today we're going to discuss all things related to the Metaverse, as well as Dan's essay, and also Dan Churchwell, who has a review in there that we will be discussing as well. So to this end, I'm joined by Dan Huger, Acton's librarian and a research associate, and Dan Churchwell, director of program outreach here at Acton. So Dan Huger, why don't I start with, I just realized I have multiple Dans and you're now going to be known only by last names for the rest of this program. Let's start with you. If you could give us, tell us about your piece, The Metaverse Does Not Exist.
So when I was initially approached by the editor, Anthony Sacramone of Religion and Liberty, they were talking about doing a theme issue of the Metaverse. I started thinking through, what is the Metaverse? And the reality of it is, the Metaverse at this point is a dream, despite the fact that we've had, major corporations like Facebook rename themselves Meta, dedicate themselves to the project of building the Metaverse. The Metaverse does not yet exist. What we have are some demos, some sort of games, some sort of, concepts for this sort of thing. And so I thought, where we are now is really nowhere different than we were 30 years ago, which is when the term metaverse is first coined in a work of science fiction. This is something, the idea of an immersive world where you can put on a headset, where you have some sort of representation of yourself, some sort of avatar where you go in and do these things is something that is newly potentially technically possible, but is still a dream. And I thought, the people who have spent the longest time thinking through this are the great science fiction novelists. And the touchstone for me for this was Philip K. Dick, who was an American science fiction author, started writing 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s. And Dick is an interesting person in all sorts of ways. One, his works have been sort of uniquely adaptable into film. Hollywood's made a lot of movies. A lot of people are familiar with Blade Runner, for instance, an adaptation of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. Total Recall, which is an adaptation of a short story. We can remember it for you wholesale. Minority Report, Through a Scanner Darkly, the Richard Linklater film, all of these sorts of things. So Dick has a resonance, and there's a way in which his vision of sort of alternate worlds is terrifying, consistently terrifying. There are a few exceptions where it's banal or where it is, in at least one case, there's a sort of salutary metaverse, or at least the possibility in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, where Dick talks about a metaverse sort of thing becoming a religion. And Dick is also interesting because he's a very unconventional Christian, but he thought deeply about Christian theology in very idiosyncratic ways and thought to give a sort of theological vision behind this. So the center of this essay is actually a novel he wrote in 1965 called The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And this is one in which access to alternate worlds is mediated through drugs. Two drugs in particular, Can-D and Chew-Z, marketed by rival corporations. There's Chew-Z, there's an enigmatic sort of industrialist, Palmer Eldritch, who had disappeared for years, returns. And I think thinking through these issues along with the science fiction writers gives us a very different perspective on this, because what you have in Silicon Valley today are the sort of utopian possibilities of the metaverse. And they seem unconcerned about how these sorts of alternate worlds will affect society, our construction of ourselves. And the mentality is exactly the opposite among science fiction writers, where they see how dangerous it is to blur reality and fantasy. And they see this sort of through their own experience. Philip K. Dick gave a very famous speech in a science fiction convention that I reference extensively in the piece called How to Build a Universe That Doesn't Fall Apart 3 Days Later. And he talks about the challenges of building these alternate worlds. And he talks about the way in which even those who construct these worlds, the science fiction authors, often don't know what is real and what is fantasy in their own works. And so I try to take us through anywhere from the sort of what I call the pathetic, the sort of alternate worlds in terms of as a substitute for community, socialization. Very famously, Mark Zuckerberg, when one of these early demos, he walks into this room of other friends and avatars. And what are they doing? They're playing cards around a table, which is something you could do with your friends anywhere. Internet poker's been around since the 90s. And this is sort of, the metaverse is a game. There are more ambitious sort of theorists of the metaverse that view this as, a potential sort of substitute for reality. And that's the sinister aspect. And that's where I get into particularly the Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch novel. And then there's the sort of banal things where, you can do, shopping online and you can walk through a grocery store and that sort of thing. And I tried to walk through sort of what's the animating desires for there, because I think the story of the metaverse so far is a story of dreams. But those dreams can tell us something about the world we're living in, about how people are orienting themselves in the world, and what they put their faith and their trust in. And that's sort of some of the central themes of the essay. The essay is up now and will be linked through in the show notes. But that's sort of just a general unpacking of some of the themes to get us started.
Part of what stood out to me in your essay, as well as in your comments there, is your point about Hollywood adapting these into films and how they're almost all dystopian. And you juxtapose that with the sensibilities of the people in Silicon Valley who are trying to craft things like the metaverse now. And as you pointed out, the almost completely utopian approach to what is going to be produced by all of this. And I can't help but think of when Facebook and Twitter themselves were originally created, the aspirations for it were it's going to be wonderful. We're going to, connect the entire world. People are going to be able to interact with people, in tons of different places, and it's all going to be sunshine and lollipops and fantastic. And fast forward, 10, 12, 13, 15 years later, I joked for a while that with only his billions of dollars to salve his wounds, that Jack Dorsey from Twitter used to wake up in cold sweats at 3 a.m, realizing he created the thing that got Donald Trump elected president of the United States. And they are proceeding to build this metaverse without any real recognition for the dystopian possibilities of it. There's just like with the creation of the original social media platforms, everything is going to be fantastic. It's going to be wonderful. And there doesn't seem to be much of a recognition of how easily it could translate into dystopia, like we see what Hollywood has done with Philip K. Dick's stories.
Which shows that they're very not well read in the history of technology or the conversation, the philosophy of technology. I mean, Roy Amara, the futurist, he's dead now, but he was famous for saying, and it's coined as the Amara's law, that we vastly overestimate the effect of any given technology in the short term, but vastly underestimate its effect in the long term. And I think with Metaverse, you can see that it's the hype. It's usually, especially the copy coming out of Silicon Valley, is usually utopian. But the people thinking deeper or have read about these kinds of concepts in a little more substantive way, it does tend to lean dystopian.
The part that I also can't quite get over, at least where we're at with it right now, is that preview that you saw of Mark Zuckerberg in the metaverse and all of that, is how unimpressive it all seems. That, I don't know if any of you remember Second Life from a decade ago.
Right.
It doesn't seem like it has really progressed all that much further than what you had in Second Life. So like I loved, Dan, that you referenced in your piece, Total Recall, right? You have what is a very vivid and believable memory, right, that's being implanted. The idea that you can remember these things that you didn't actually do, but it seems completely real. You can't not be cognizant of how artificial and how, just like with Second Life too, how much it is just like a cheap synthetic copy of actual life. This is the part with like Second Life stuff I never understood. Like, why do I want to put, either a headset on or log on to a computer to do the same banal things that I do in my daily life? I never understood what the attraction to that was supposed to be.
You have, on the one hand, the dream of this thing. And you have, on the other hand, the reality of this thing as we have it now. And it reminds me, Dick articulates his fears of his contemporary sort of the 1978 reality. And he describes it as, is describing television. He said, words and pictures are synchronized. The possibility of total control of the viewer exists, especially in the young viewer. TV viewing is a kind of sleep learning. Recent experiments indicate that much of what we see on the TV screen is received on a subliminal basis. We only imagine that we consciously see what is there. The bulk of the messages elude our attention, literally. After a few hours of TV watching, we do not know what we have seen. Our memories are spurious, like our memories of dreams. The blanks are filled in retrospectively and falsified. We have participated unknowingly in the creation of a spurious reality, and then we have obligingly fed it to ourselves. We have colluded in our own doom. What's very interesting about this is how no one is watching TV today. At least in the sort of way that, okay, there are 3 channels beaming a sort of unified message to you. And the way that TV is often, as seductive as that sort of description indicates, it's still a screen on the other end of the room. And people have no problem detecting, let's say, the sensationalism of the television news, or at least many. So there's also, I think the dystopian power of the seductive power of something like this is somewhat overblown. At the same time, there are some people who do believe everything they see on TV. There are people that get lost in worlds like Second Life, in worlds like World of Warcraft. I'm not much of a gamer myself, but what's very interesting to me, the most disheartening point is, it will say how much time you have spent doing this. And it is, I think, and this is where I think the primary temptation is this pathetic sort of temptation that I talk about in the 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. The real temptation is that this serves as a distraction for real life. Not that you get lost in it, but that neighbors you would have served, projects you would have undertaken, all the sorts of service you do to community and neighbor, somehow the time that's always needed for those things gets sucked away. And I think that's the real danger of the metaverse, not that you enter this totally dystopian vision, but rather that you are captivated just enough that we see real effects in the real world that degrade community, that degrade friendship, that degrade the sort of solidarity that we'd have in a world without these not quite immersive experiences.
Well, it's not just Philip K. Dick, too. I mean, if it's interesting that era of writers, they're always referring to some kind of drug that's going to take you. I mean, dozens of writers use that example, and it coming out of the 60s and 70s is probably
understandable.
Culturally analogous to what's going on. But it's to take you out of your mind. and place you somewhere else. And obviously they couldn't foresee, what we now know as VR in the proper sense. But I think it's interesting that they always it comes down to metaphysics, and not to get too boring here, but the idea of what is really real, what is the stuff around us, and then it lends eventually in the commercialized sense of VR, virtual reality, the metaverse is hyper individualistic. And you're able to choose. I mean, look what the internet now. The vast majority of the volume of the internet traffic, any given day, is largely pornography and gambling. And I mean, think of all the business applications that have been hyped, and we all use it, different software systems, et cetera, and all of the different businesses that we're a part of, and in our daily life. But seriously, 75-80% of the traffic, they just go to these things, vices that most people would argue are vices. And so what will the metaverse just emerge into that? I mean, there's questions that are pretty obvious, or we've seen them roll out in technologies from the not very distant past.
This may be a bit of a digression, but you made me think of this with the excerpt that you read about television and the point you made about community. If I can find it, I will put it in the show notes. But I remember this essay from the critic Sonny Bunch from a number of years ago about how we're living in this golden age of television, right? We keep being told that. I think it's probably largely true. The quality of what is being made today in terms of its entertainment value is quite good compared with go back and watch sitcoms or programs from the 1960s, 1970s, which are very schlocky. The community part, I think, is interesting. And he made this point in the essay that you used to have the ability to talk about like what was going on these programs with just about anybody. I looked this up real quick. The number of people that watched the final episode of MASH, 105.9 million people. The last big program show that achieved, I think, really seeped into the culture was probably Game of Thrones on HBO. And one, that it's different in the sense of going from 3 networks that are broadcasting this to this being a pay-for service on top of your cable subscription. But nonetheless, it was very much there in the culture. The final episode was watched by 19.3 million people. So even if you're using something like television as a cultural touchstone with which to connect in the real world with other people, there are fewer and fewer people. And you're finding, just like with what happened with social media, you're finding smaller and smaller groups of people that are all hyper-focused on one very small thing rather than the common culture part of it that used to exist with broadcast television, when it really was broadcast and not narrowcasting like you have now, not only with entertainment, I think we should point out, but also with news. Mm-hmm. If you look at Fox News, MSNBC, the people make such a big deal in the political world out of what Tucker Carlson says, and the number of people that actually watch Tucker Carlson's show is really minuscule. But it is a purposeful strategy that it is better from Fox News's or MSNBC's perspective to have a very sticky 1% of the population than to try to broaden the appeal of what they're broadcasting to try to get a 10%, a 15%.
It's hyper-segmentation.
Yes.
Hyper-segmentation.
And this is one of Matthew Ball, who's written sort of the big book on the metaverse and how it will revolutionize everything, gets to this point. And he sees it, his definition of the metaverse is that I describe it as a massively scaled and interoperable network of 3D rendered real-time virtual worlds, which can be experienced persistently and synchronously, but by an effectively unlimited number of users, each with an individual sense of presence. What I'm effectively describing is a virtual plane parallel to the physical world, which, in addition to be able to do many things that we can't do in the real world, replicates it. We all participate at the same time with no cap on what we can do, why we can do it, and how many people can participate. The key there, I think, is the idea that this is worlds. And we see this in miniature with social media and how you can, I think the risk is not that everyone is subsumed in one metaverse, but that everyone retreats into their own personal metaverse. So this is the nightmare reality, is this idea that you have this increasingly fragmented, just as we're seeing an increasingly fragmented media landscape. And there are all sorts of good things about this. This sort of Orwellian sort of dystopia recedes into the background. But you run the risk of these emerging sort of solipsistic utopias. You get distortions of how people interpret reality. We've talked about this before at the very small number of Twitter users and how that drives mass media, and the very small segment even of Twitter users who are tweeting a lot. So I'm worried you get these distortionary effects. The real world persists, will keep going on without this. But there are, I think, real chances of leakages into the real world and increasingly narrow sort of subcultures that make, I think this is part of our political polarization. I think this is part of, you get, endemics of loneliness, depression, these sorts of things. All of this has the potential to further erode community solidarity if we give ourselves over to it.
Dan, I want you to introduce your piece, but before that, I want to ask a question for you both to respond to, because you've both brought it up. You, Dan Huger, in the context of the story, the Philip K. Dick story that you focus on in your piece, and Dan Churchwell, you in context of the 1960s and 70s and some of this stuff was being written. Should we think about this phenomenon of the metaverse like we think about drugs? I'm reminded of this piece that I read from Yuval Levin, and we had him on the Acton line to discuss, where he made an interesting point. The whole piece was examining social trends that in a vacuum we would probably celebrate, that there's, for example, fewer teen pregnancies now than there were 20, 25 years ago. But Yuval points out kind of the underlying reasons that we're getting these trends, that fewer teenagers are having sex, fewer teenagers are dating. He made an interesting observation in there about drug use as well, that go back to the 1980s, and a quite popular drug of choice was cocaine, which, while certainly not recommending anybody use it, it makes you go faster, want to do more things. The drug of choice now are opiates, things that make you drop out and disassociate from friends, family, community, reality. Is this keeping in line then with this kind of how it's given to dystopia, that this is another, we think of the metaverse like an opiate, that it is something for people to utilize to drop out rather than to engage?
I think anytime you have something, and we have this all in our pockets, we have a means of escape now at any time. And I think the analogy with drugs is a fruitful one in that sense. You have, in South Korea, there are now clinics that treat video game addiction, and apologies to gamers, you may rise up later. But what we see with these patterns of behavior is an attempt to either find meaning somewhere else in the world or a despair as to meaning. And this is just something that gets me through the day, is, well, I can't go to sleep now, so let's do this, opioids, video games, all the sort of things you can do to pass the time. And I think, that's a very marked difference between what the world's great religions teach, which are different paths to redeeming the time, to bringing meaning into the world rather than withdrawing from the world. So I think that analogy is completely appropriate. But I worry also that these things are different in terms of treatments, in terms of the challenges that people face. But I think they are all forms of escapism. You see people fretting about novels being this in the 18th and 19th centuries. You know, there are these big books that particularly young ladies disappear into for hours on end. So I think that there's, I think you have to guard against a sort of moral panic about these sorts of things. I think they're real. I think that these present an increasing variety of options tailor-suited to individuals to drop out sort of on their own terms.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. The idea of the opiates. I mean, opiates treat pain. And coke, you look at all the movies from the 80s or that portray the 80s, everybody doing coke. You're right. It's the Wall Streeter. It's the person wanting to do more and greater things.
Wanting to stay up until 3 or 4
exactly,
in the morning. Yeah.
Exactly. And so now you have, when you see the real statistics, the opiates, they treat pain. And so there's obviously, you get back to what is it about the world that is driving people to deaths of despair, and which are rising as well. And so especially in the Western world, when we have, what was popular in the late 90s and early 2000s, and it's still around, but the word flourishing, human flourish was on every kind of grant or building, or, what does it mean to flourish? Well, that's the perennial question. What is the good life? And if you look, it's a very complex question and nuanced. I mean, even for gamers right now, physiologists are worried, doctors are worried about not just the raw, like the screen time, the eye strain, but the immobility of the human body. Biomechanics, right? They're worried about your body is meant to move. And so all of the intertwined issues of just staying still, staring at a screen, it's trying to feed something, but the drug use and the ability to go into a different world because your own world is banal or there's something there that's not, you're not feeling fully human, I think is a major question that we will be asking into the future.
Yeah, from drugs originally intended to treat physical pain become drugs that are treating some kind of
existential
mental
pain
or spiritual pain that
absolutely.
People have, and this kind of lost sense of meaning and an enmeshedness within a community and people who care about you. Dan Churchwell, I want you to set up the piece. So you reviewed 2 books for the essay that you have in this fall issue of Religion and Liberty, Digital Communion, Marshall McLuhan's Spiritual Vision for a Virtual Age, and Redeeming Technology, A Christian Approach to Healthy Digital Habits. And tell us about your piece.
The editor asked me to kind of compare and contrast these 2 pieces, these 2 books. I really enjoyed Nick Rapatrizzone's book, Digital Communion, is kind of the exploration. Much ink has been spilled on Marshall McLuhan, who was one of the famous media ecologists. Some people might be familiar with it or not. Neil Postman, one of a student who came after Marshall McLuhan, kind of coined the term, but they created a whole new discipline of thinking about what are these new medias and what are they doing to us. And Marshall McLuhan was famous for the idea of the global village. These phrases, the medium is the message. In fact, even most people don't, Timothy Leary, famous for his turn on, tune in, or drop out, that was McLuhan. He was stealing McLuhan's phrase. And Marshall McLuhan was this kind of understated professor from Canada who went and got further training in Cambridge, and he came to America in multiple places. He was a guest lecturer for a year at Fordham University, and they paid him $100,000 to be a guest lecturer, which in today's dollars is $800,000 to lecture for a year, doing 2 classes a week. And so he blew up, this understated professor who was highly impacted by his Catholic faith. He was a convert when he went to Cambridge. He grew up kind of low church Canadian Baptist and felt the anti-intellectual movement of it drove him to the Catholic Church, G.K. Chesterton, Gerard Manley Hopkins. So the literature, the poetry, and the liturgy of the Catholic Church is what really created within him a theological vision. But the reason these two books are interesting is in the vast majority of McLuhan's writings, nothing is very overt. He's not quoting scripture. He's not referring to encyclicals, or it's not a very overt engagement with the technology, with the media issues that he's dealing with. But yet, what Nick Rapatrizone does is he laces through and shows how his deep-seated Catholic theology, philosophy, and moral imagination really did influence virtually all of his writing. And so he plugs a hole in McLuhan's studies that I think a lot of people don't see very well. And then on the flip side, this other book by two Lutherans, a Lutheran pastor and a Lutheran psychologist, theirs is very overt, very, very explanatory, very theologically, this is for Bible study, this is for small group study, let's talk about technology. It's laced with scripture, it's laced with biblical allusions, and so it's comparing and contrasting what theology or theological influences can do within any given discipline.
So when we talk about these sort of issues of media ecology, do either of these authors, and you said McLuhan is much less explicit about his religious faith, do they draw analogies between the media environment and the sort of proposed alternative realities and the sort of proclamation of the gospel, the spiritual life of the church? Because there's a way in which, that is the sort of religious project is also, in a sense, a narratival project of getting people to enter into a story that is, concurrent with our actual lived reality. But do they see something for the church to learn, or do they see something for the church to be wary of in these sort of modern forms of media?
Yeah, McLuhan's very first book, The Mechanical Bride, was a series of essays that talked a lot about advertising and other pieces, and it had a little bit more of a moralistic take. But after The Mechanical Bride, all of his famous writings, it was almost devoid of anything like that. And he, in fact, he's in the piece I describe and quote this idea that he's like, I am not a moralist. I am not here to put moral dimensions on these. I'm here to explore or to probe. That was his favorite phrase. I want to probe and ask questions and just be. And so for him, that it threw people off because it was not an evangelist. He was not an evangelistic, if you will, writer at all.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, you have these other two writers engaging the topic from a very distinctly theologically Lutheran position. Lutheranism has a very, obviously with Luther and other vocation, the idea of vocation, who we are is, and so you have them alternating between a pastoral author's voice and a psychologist, author's voice, talking about the promises and perils of technology. So I don't find either of them overly pessimistic. I find they're both trying to be balanced, but the McLuhan book, Digital Communion, is, it just shows very clearly that he was not interested in introducing the Catholic faith necessarily per se, but that his Catholic faith and the theology and the history and the philosophy that undergirds the Catholic faith was embedded in almost all of his writing. So it's like this strange juxtaposition.
Yeah, it reminds me of Bill Buckley's line about his politics, saying, my faith informs my views.
Yeah.
It is not – Bill Buckley's politics were not evangelical towards the Catholic cause, but they nonetheless clearly informed by his faith there. So Dan, the title of your piece, which we will publish next Monday, so people who are listening to this, hold on till next Monday to read that.
Oh, great.
The screen is not your master. I wonder if you could comment on the pull quote here that we have introducing it. We need not be held captive by our tech if we take the time to understand it and how it has the capacity to change us, often without our being aware it's doing so. How do you think we are being changed by technology and our utilization of it?
So I'm particularly animated in my own studies and thinking on this by the reminder that within every technology, its negativity lies therein. In other words, this is Paul Virilio, the Italian philosopher and social critic. He argues that with the invention of the ship came the invention of the shipwreck. With the invention of the airplane came the invention of the air crash. With the invention of electricity came the invention of electrocution. And so we're back to my other comment about Silicon Valley. People just forget or don't want to hype or think about, with any technology, there is some sort of social change happening, and it's positive and negative. And usually, if you're trying to sell something, you don't want to emphasize the negative. Back to Roy Amara, it's hard to foresee some technologies. I mean, all technologies are created. So there's an architect, there's a creator, and there's a designer, and there are case studies that some are overtly misogynistic or racist, or you can have some conversations where you can literally see that. But a lot of these creators, they're just so full of energy, so full of hope and utopian vision that willfully they don't see the possible downsides or can't, and so. The ways our technologies are changing us. I mean, if you think the iPhone was at 14 years old now, and give or take, and it's just the smartphone itself. Sorry, it just dominates the world in a way that we couldn't imagine 14 years ago. And so when you think about virtual reality, when you think about these other contexts being built into our tech, the problem is that most people think of technology as impactful as the smartphone is. I mean, concrete is a technology, and the shipping container is a technology, and so it's the technology now that's it's the efficiency and the person management systems that worry me the most. An article in the New York Times, an expose here about 2 weeks ago, talking about the new scientific management, because the work from home kind of world that we live in now, companies are saying, okay, is that employee actually working? And so they're quickly inventing all of these keystroking is really old, but now these opportunities, how much your mouse wiggles is, honest to God, a new thing, a new metric. You have to agree in a lot of these companies when you work from home that your camera can take a picture of you at any time. And so you don't have control of the camera on your, so if you're not at your desk, if you're at, long restroom break or whatever, you have to agree to all of these things. And now, of course, all the companies coming around letting people cheat, figuring out, that those always go hand in hand. But there was a story in that article about a chaplaincy in a large medical company that covers all of it. I think this was in Minneapolis. An insurance company. They have now put so many metrics on their people that the chaplains, they get their list for the day of who they have to go see, and there's a point value assigned to a cancer patient, to a patient who's dying, to a patient who just broke their foot, and they're given different points. And if they don't reach their certain point value, by the end of the day, they get docked in pay. And so now the perverse incentive through their technologies that if they spend too long with a patient who's dying, it's actually a negative outcome on their performance evaluation to spend time with that family, with that dying individual that, of course, you couldn't predict who's going to die day to day. And so now they're quoted, these chaplains are saying, I now do drive-by chaplaincy. And so these perverse incentives that some of these technologies, but we all need a job, life is short and I need to pay the bills. So we agree to some of these things, and technology is moving so fast. It's the speed at which this technological change, the moment we're in right now, I think, is the most distinctive from other industrial revolution opportunities.
What is the ability to revolutionize also can contain the seeds of its own destruction.
Absolutely.
What I'm thinking here is, where my mind went to is Moneyball.
Yeah.
As a baseball fan,
Yep.
What that approach to understanding the game of baseball, sabermetrics and analytics, and what Bill James was able to create while working as a security guard at a pork and beans factory, revolutionized the game. It gets you the story of the 2002 Oakland A's and how they put together this team that was really greater than the sum of its parts. And it leads to the state of baseball now, where you have baseball making rule changes that will go into effect next year to try to deal with what has robbed the sport of why people want to watch it. The defensive shifts that move 4 players on one side of or 3 players on one side of the second base bag. So for people who are pull hitters and likely to hit the ball on the ground, everything becomes a ground out rather than being, a hit. So they're going to change that. It's you had this approach that, on one hand, could take a team like the Oakland A's, who just didn't have as much money to compete with teams like the Yankees, and make them more competitive. But part of the effect of that was making the game kind of less interesting, except for the very dedicated fans of the sport itself.
Yeah, and you use the word revolutionize, and usually that a lot of times that's using a positive. It revolutionize. It's like new and ooh. Well, I would just argue that it's word, and that's what McLuhan, words really meant things to him, and the idea of, and he loved puns and those kinds of ideas. But I would just argue it changed the game. It evolved, but whether that's good or bad, the Moneyball, it seemed to say that was a positive thing. Well, it did change the game, but whether that was good or bad, I think is well, like you said, up for debate.
So with what Dan has brought to this conversation, I am now wondering if not that the metaverse doesn't exist, but the metaverse has always existed. And that through technological change, through the introduction of new ideas, these things revolutionize, in this value-neutral sense, our way of interacting with the world. And so my question is, how do you institute a sort of counter-revolution? How does one look at, Major League Baseball is doing it by rules changes next year. So there are no shortage of people, say, suggesting, particularly with, not the metaverse yet, but very much with social media now, new government regulation, perhaps the breakup of tech companies. You have other people like, I think of Andy Crouch, TechWise Family, talking about ways that, families can prioritize their technological use and sort of elucidate their values in their own homes. Is there either those sorts of remedies, or is there perhaps, now an imperative to come up with a sort of technological solution to our technological problems?
That's interesting. I mean, I don't know if it's technological per se, but I mean, now the revolutionary, if you want to be a kid and you want to be countercultural and, you're off social media.
Yeah.
You're off Spotify. You're off, the new, the new rebel. I mean, they're really, if you look at the new generation, they're in fact, there's studies on this, that the idea of it, like rebellion and outright, those kinds of things are going down because the technology kind of just mollifies. And so I don't know if there's a technological solution to the. I mean, no, I don't know if I. As I hear you say that, I don't think piling on more technological. I think it's much more embodied, much more human, much more conversational. The opportunity, I mean, to have counterculture now is to have somebody over to your house for dinner. Yeah. It is to know it is to be on the local neighborhood board. The embodied. If we're embodied creatures, and especially at Acton, we talk a lot about what does it mean to be human, and the interaction with institutions around us. Yes, there are some goods that I could call or text or tweet people, and have some kind of change. But I'm going to argue this change starts small. And it starts with embodied interactions. And so I am less interested in more technology to solve technology. I just don't see that as a way. I'm not anti-tech, but I just don't see technology as the savior that the majority of people in the industry like to claim it is.
What I think is interesting. I usually dislike talking in terms of generations and the classifications we give to generations. Right? Jonah Goldberg makes this joke that if you were storming the beaches of Normandy, it's fair to call you a member of the greatest generation. If you were in the drunk tank in Peoria, like, do you really get to live off the glory of the people who did that?
Sure.
But to use it, I think, in a rather benign way here to make this point, and it is a slightly self-serving point, but I'll let people pile on me for that if they want to. I think, in a sense, millennials are in a very interesting position because the millennial generation is one that now having children, them growing up, I was born in 82. I obviously, given what I do professionally and what we, just how we all exist in this world of modern technology, I have a laptop sitting in front of me that's connected to the internet. But I remember connecting to the internet for the first time in high school, where it was that crazy dial-up sound and AOL said, "You've got mail." So I remember what life was like without it. And I know what life is like with it, compared to people who are kids these days, which is why what I think is really interesting, Dan, about your point about what it's like to be countercultural in a sense is to be off of all of these things. I think it's very interesting. But that is a generation that it has always existed as long as they have been alive. They're completely immersed in a world where it is just as easy to talk to somebody who is next door as it is to talk to somebody who is in the Philippines. And I wonder if that perspective of millennials being able to remember what the world was like before all of this stuff was introduced and how that may influence their own child-rearing experience, to understand, I enjoy a lot that the technological world has offered us, but I think a good example of it would be this. It is incredibly useful to me as I'm going to get on a plane later today, and I have all the music I could ever want to access on my phone. But you know what? It still sounds better on vinyl records. And that is an experience that is not really replaceable because the sound quality is different. And even just what, I like being able to do what people used to do and that Spotify and all those things have gotten us away from. Put the record on and just sit there and listen to it. That it's not something to be played in the background while you're doing something else. It is something meant to be experienced. I think that is the attractiveness of that, I think, is inherent. And I'm wondering if we see more people seeking out those kinds of experiences that disconnect us from modern technology, but certainly in that example I gave, are connecting us to a different kind of technology, but different than the everything on demand immediately technology that we currently have.
I mean, I think you have the makings, to paraphrase Theodore Roszak, you have the makings of a counterculture here. I think you really do. There is not a day that goes by where there isn't a story in a major newspaper, major magazine about people doing sort of digital detoxes, or people, horrific stories of people whose careers are destroyed by social media mobs, these sorts of things. Now, I think there's a bad way to do that, and there's a good way to do that. There's a retreat to nostalgia, but there's also a way in which we can return to the human person, and we can return and think through what it is to be human, who we are in the world, and where we place our trust. When you brought up your Lutheran authors, I end my piece with a reference to Luther's Small Catechism, and what is it. When he says, when the Ten Commandments say you shall have no other gods, what does this mean? And his answer is that we should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. And that, of course, has a sort of spiritual dimension to us, but it also has a way of orienting us in the world to all other people and all other human goods. And it gives us a place to sort of, okay, I mentioned redeeming the time earlier. The other part of that verse is because the days are evil. Mm-hmm. And how, this is the ground that you have to begin on to discerning, all of the complexities in the world, so those technological upsides and downsides that you talked about earlier. And that can ground us as human persons oriented towards God to make those sort of decisions and then go out and act in the world accordingly. And that might look different for different people. Prudentially, that might look different for different families. But I have a feeling that as people, the more rooted in God and community that people are, I think they'll make similar trade-offs, if not the same trade-offs, and they'll bring us in a direction away from something as totalizing as the metaverse. Because the promise of the metaverse is what? All of this, but more. More immersive, more integrated. It's not just a game, it's a whole world in which you play all the games. It's not, it's also where you shop. It's also where you don't need that. And I think, there's a real place of pain. We talked about addiction. We talked about other, there's real pain in the world. The days are evil. But there is a human person-centered approach to approaching those problems. And it is mindful of these technological trade-offs. And it's informed by the common good.
The idea too there is where will people have these conversations that would be conceived as now maybe countercultural, and it's the idea of is there a transcendent? Is there these religious questions? These very clearly theological questions that Joseph Pieper talked about this idea of visual noise, the idea that the modern age is made up of visual noise, and he died before it emerged into what we have now. And so where are those quiet places? Why is being alone in your own head, like having your own thoughts, not mediated by music, not mediated by visual stimuli, not that is now countercultural to have some sort of quiet time and thinking about your world that then leads to thinking about religious existential questions. And so I would argue that the church is an institution where that brings opportunity back. Churches should have Faraday bags where you put all your phones when you walk. It just, where do we get the opportunity to think and to sing and to look at something that isn't of my own choice? Like you said, Eric, earlier, our content, you have all your music, anything is at your fingertips. It's just, we can choose it. And I am the God of that content. And I think we need places, and I do believe the local church is a place, and they do that very well in the second part of my essay of the book regarding what does church have to do with helping us think through these technological questions, because we're not getting it very, very many other places. So I think that the institution of the local church will help.
Dan Huger's essay in the fall issue of Religion and Liberty is The Metaverse Does Not Exist, and we will include that in the show notes. Dan Churchwell's essay in that issue is The Screen is Not Your Master. That will be published a week from today on October 10th. So if you're listening to this sufficiently in the future, I will go back in and add it to the show notes. So our own little manipulation of time and space there. So if you're more than a week later than when this was published, you can look in the show notes and find the link to Dan Churchwell's essay in the fall edition of Religion and Liberty, focusing on the metaverse. So we'll call it a wrap there. Thank you for listening to Acton Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look in the show notes for a link where you can subscribe directly to Acton Unwind, or just search Acton Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find our program. Thank you to Dan. Thank you to Dan for the Acton Institute. I'm Eric Kohn. We'll see you next week.